One thing is, I think that what matters for people is how many times they've seen it come and go.
Yeah.
So if you were not aware of like the first 3 cycles, for example, and you knew about it in the 4th cycle, or at least you paid attention to the price, you remember seeing it in a bull market, you remember seeing it in a bear market, you see it in a bull market again. You know, that for them, that's only the 2nd cycle, even if it might be the 5th cycle of Bitcoin. And when you look, of course, if you look at a price chart in linear form, you don't even see those earlier price bumps. So you only ever really have your memory, or in visual form, you see the past couple cycles. So I think people have to go through a handful of cycles, not just that Bitcoin's gone through those cycles, but that they've seen it gone through those cycles. I think that's important. And 2, the volatility is still an issue until it's not. Basically, until it's widely adopted and liquid enough.
린알드는 투자 전략가이자 재무 분석가입니다. 그녀는 거시경제와 자산 분석에 대한 전문 지식으로 유명한데요. 특히나 비트코인에 대해 매우 낙관적인 전망을 보고 있습니다. 그녀는 2023년도 스완 비트코인 컨퍼런스에서 인터뷰를 통해 비트코인에 일어나야 할 2가지 주요 촉매제에 대해 상세히 설명했습니다. 첫 번째는 사람들이 비트코인에 대한 신뢰를 가지려면 여러 번의 사이클을 경험해야 한다는 점입니다. 2021년 많은 사람들에게 비트코인이나 크립토에 대해 처음 들어본 시기였고, 이제 사람들은 크립토와 비트코인은 본질적으로 의미가 없다고 보고 있습니다. 2번 또는 3번의 주기가 지나고 나서야 사람들은 이게 실존하고 사라지지 않는다고 믿게 됩니다. 2번째로 린은 비트코인같이 큰 시총을 갖는 경우에도 대형 기관이나 국부펀드가 이 분야에 진입하기에는 거래량이 충분하지 않다고 주장합니다. 비트코인의 다음 주기가 어떻게 될지, 린의 비트코인 관점이 어떻게 되는지 영상 끝까지 보시기 바랍니다. 이제 그녀의 전망에 대해 알아보겠습니다.
Bitcoin has to reach certain levels of market size and liquidity before it even interests certain bigger players to get in. So when Bitcoin had $1,000 in daily trading volume, a person couldn't put in $1 million. When Bitcoin had $1 million in daily trading volume, a billionaire couldn't, you couldn't come in with $1 billion. It wasn't ready for sale yet, for example.
Yeah.
When it trades $1 billion a day, these large pools of capital, like a $1 trillion insurance fund, it's just, they look at that and it's like a small pond for them. It's like they would sneeze at it and it would move the price. When it does tens or hundreds of trillions of dollars in volume, then these bigger players can start looking at it. So it's almost like you have to kind of saturate, or at least you have to hit a certain level before you even get interest from the next level. So now we're at the phase where the BlackRocks of the world are kind of paying attention to it. So one is just, you can keep going up in that one psychological cycle. So people, once a person has directly seen 3 cycles, for example, that's hard to forget. And then 2, that liquidity. And then the other angle, like that's kind of Bitcoin winning. The other way is the dollar losing. The dollar tripping over itself. So a lot of people here, maybe not everyone, is seeing what happened in the recent bond market move, right? So long end bonds have sold off dramatically in recent weeks and months. The yields are spiking. And whether or not what happens in the next few months or whatever, I think that's not the big story. The big story is that historically, when you get larger and larger debt in an economy, eventually you run into a big bubble. And then what happens is the public sector absorbs that debt onto the public sector. Right? So that's what we saw in Japan over the past 30 years. We saw a gigantic private debt bubble, and then kind of a deleveraging, printing money, and then a lot of that debt is now on the public sector, and the private sector in Japan has less debt relative to other metrics than it used to, less net debt, because a lot of that's now on the public sector. And in the United States, we saw pre-global financial crisis, we saw more and more private debt growth. Then we saw the whole collapse and the money printing. And now we see some degree of household deleveraging and things like that, but all that debt's now on the public level. And then what happens is when you run into the next cycle or the one after that, and all that debt's already on the public level, you're getting higher and higher interest expense. You're not offsetting it with lower and lower interest rates, right? So for example, during the past 40 years in the United States, we had higher and higher public debt to GDP, and we had lower and lower interest rates. So the interest expense on the public debt was never really a problem. But once we hit the point where you hit 0 and you bounce off 0, and now you're just kind of either going sideways or you're going up in interest rates while you're still going up in debt to GDP ratios, that's when you start to get into an outright fiscal spiral. And if the Fed finds itself having to do QE, even when they have above target inflation, because they just have to monetize the deficits, That's kind of a checkmate scenario. We already see Japan in that scenario. So
Do you think we've crossed that event horizon now?
I think we're flirting with the event horizon.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically, once you get over, say, 100% debt to GDP, and it's usually a couple mix. It's usually like you get above a certain amount, you bounce off zero interest rates, now you're just either flat to up, and then you run into some degree of commodity shortage, energy shortage, a pandemic, whatever what you run into some sort of like supply side thing, and that combination is like fireworks.
Yeah.
And so Japan today, they have a 2% inflation target. They've been above their target, and they're still doing QE because they're in that weird position. So money creation happens in one of two ways. Either banks lend it into existence with fractional reserve banking, or you monetize very large government deficits. And when public debt is small, like say back in the United States in the 70s, most money creation comes from bank lending. And if you raise interest rates, you kind of slow down the bank lending. And although you do increase the government deficit because of your interest expense, that's a smaller portion. So higher interest rates are suppressive for money creation. Whereas if you are all the way in Japan's case, where you have like 250% debt to GDP and very little bank lending, it's a very sluggish economy. If you raise rates, you're actually potentially accelerating money supply growth because now the government is pouring more money into the economy due to payments on its own debt levels.
Which is very counterintuitive
Yes.
to what, yeah.
And so that's kind of either the end stage of the currency or at least kind of the end stage of what, say, Ray Dalio would call a long-term debt cycle. So some sort of major devaluation, recapitalization of the market. So if the dollar trips over itself and the Fed finds itself in kind of what Japan's doing, but Japan has a trade surplus, current account surplus. They've built up a positive net international investment position. The United States is running a structural trade deficit. And if they also find themselves forced to constantly do QE just to maintain the bond market, and Bitcoin's still here, and people have seen 3 cycles of Bitcoin, I wouldn't want to be short Bitcoin, let's say.
Yeah.
But now, the way bear markets often work is first it's the scary crash, and then it's like the boring malaise. And that's when people that are not focused on the ecosystem forget about it. Like most people outside of Bitcoin don't care about Bitcoin right now. We care, they don't care. And so right now I think we're in the then they forget you phase, at least cyclically. When we think like bigger picture, the whole first they fight you and then they join you, I think that's going to be a multi-phase process. Like maybe BlackRock wants to join us because they can make money. But there's other things that are still going to be in the fighting us phase, right? Yep. And even things that join us could later fight us, And so I think we're still going to be in multi-years of some are joining, some are fighting, some are joining and fighting. They're in the Thunderdome with us now, and BlackRock maybe has an opinion on a soft fork in the future, and we got to deal with that. So I think that's a non-binary thing. There's more and more, it's going to be both joining and fighting us, I think. And I think one of the biggest battles is still going to be on the privacy front. So more and more entities are like, look, you can have Bitcoin, but it's like we want to know who has the Bitcoin, and we don't want to have privacy on Bitcoin. And I think that's the thing where there's still going to be a lot of battles to fight, is the right to privacy, the right to build and deploy privacy tools, the right to have privacy tools on your phone. That's the type of thing.
린의 분석에서 비트코인의 현재 상태와 앞으로의 전망을 밝혀주는 중요한 내용이었습니다. 그녀의 미시경제학 및 자산 분석에 대한 전문 지식이 뒷받침된 독특한 관점은 암호화폐 영역의 다면적인 특성을 보여주는 것 같습니다. 매주 여러분에게 다양한 크립토 시장의 전문적인 학자들의 이야기를 근거로 들려드리면서 크립토 시장의 변화에 대해 알아가겠습니다. 린의 관점과 개인의 관점은 분명 다를 수 있습니다. 하지만 우리는 많은 사람들이 이제 크립토 시장에 대해 얘기하고 있다는 것에 주목할 필요가 있습니다. 이 영상이 여러분들의 비트코인 관점에 도움이 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 더 궁금한 사항은 하단 댓글 통해 텔레그램 입장하시면 됩니다. 이진환이었습니다. 감사합니다.